Core Confidence Life. Welcome to the Core Confidence Life. I am your host, Dennis, broadcasting to you from New York City. And on today's program, we've got a very good program for you today. I like the topic on the program, and you will too. All right? So, have you ever felt guilty about anything? You know, guilty for what you said, guilty for what you didn't say, guilty for, what you did, what you didn't do, all that. Well, that is today's topic, guilt, and how to become guilt-free, managing that particular emotion that many of us have, right? So we're talking on the program today with David Stone. He is an author and a course creator. He was on the program in the past talking about unsubscribe from anxiety. And for those of you who are looking over in the description area, you can find a link to that program to listen to him talk about his book, Unsubscribe from Anxiety. And we'll be talking a little bit about anxiety today because it kind of ties in. But we're really talking about guilt. You know, he's got a new course, uh, Guilt Free Today. It's a pretty good course. We'll be talking about it, and you can get it for free just because you are a listener to this program, and I guess now a viewer. So look in the description notes for that link. And when you go to the link to get the course, just enter Core Confidence to get your 100% off the course. Right? So on the program today, we're going to be talking about the difference between shame and guilt. I used to get that confused a little bit until someone explained it to me. Now I know. All right? So we're going to be talking about the difference between shame and guilt. We're going to also talk about the kind of guilt that could actually do you some good, a little bit of good, right? And how to resolve all the guilt gaps that we feel. So we've got an action-packed show today. He's going to go through the 8 steps you need to close that guilt gap. And we're going to get really deep in detail about what it means to tackle guilt, the different kinds of guilt, how you handle guilt, and how you break free from guilt. So just stay tuned, and you're going to get some tools for the thing that many of us try to break free of. It's kind of hard. Kind of hard, isn't it? Right, to break free from guilt? But we got your solution coming up. Okay, welcome to the Core Confidence Life. I am your host, Dennis, and we're sitting here live on video, well, live / pre-recorded, with David Stone. Now, this is David Stone's second time on the program, and as tradition, we got to appear on video for the second go-around, right? And he is the author of Unsubscribe from Anxiety, which he spoke about on the first program, and we definitely need to unsubscribe from that. But he's on the program today talking about his new program, all about getting away from guilt, right? How you doing? What's going on?
Doing great there, Dennis, and feeling not the least bit guilty about anything.
Well, good. So just remind everybody, for people who are watching this for the first time and who are meeting you for the first time here on the show, just briefly give us an overview on who you be and what you do.
All right. Well, I am a Medicare eligible teenager, and I spent, the full life and career and all the rest of it. And then just a little while ago, decided that I needed to do something far more important. And I asked what the world needs. And the world needs to be less anxious about everything, less frightened about everything, less guilty about everything. All these negative emotions that are floating around that really don't do us any good and cause us to be ill and cause us to be uncomfortable and sad and lonely. And I just think the world needs a whole lot more joy. So I took it on myself to try and work at helping people get rid of a lot of these negative emotions like anxiety and worry and guilt and fear.
Great. So Unsubscribe from Anxiety is your book that you have out now. And before we get into the topic of today, what's quickly give us some, maybe a highlight or two from Unsubscribe from Anxiety so people may want to pick it up.
Sure. The entire premise of it is that fear is a very useful response to a real and present danger. So you step out onto the street and you turn and look to the left and there's a bus bearing down on you. You feel fear, and what you do instantly is act. That fight or flight thing, which is very, very useful. It saves your life. But once you've gotten out of the way of the bus, the fear goes away and you can stop. Anxiety, though, is something different. That is sort of a chronic, long-lasting, it's a subset of fear, but it's a subset of something where we're not entirely sure what it is we're afraid of, or the thing that we think is a threat is somewhere off in the distance, a little more vague. And so we have this low-level fear, and our body is emitting all those nasty things making us sick, but we don't seem to be able to do anything about it. So my premise is that anxiety is not, well, it might be normal because everybody feels it, but it's not natural or necessary.
Absolutely. And I will throw in that, anxiety causes a lot of problems because a lot of things that we go through psychologically has a physical effect on us. And anxiety can cause physical problems, and also it could screw around with your immune system. And we don't need that.
No, if anything, we need strong immune systems, and that's why we don't want to be anxious about anything, because that leaves our immune systems nice and strong.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so let's dive into guilt. Ooh, let's get guilty.
Oh, yeah.
One of my
That
questions.
sounds like a good time.
Let's get guilty sounds like a good time. You heathen, you! Oh my God! So one of the things that I've always thought about and pondered, up until a while ago, I used to get confused on the difference between guilt and shame. I'm not confused anymore, but I used to get confused between guilt and shame. What is those two things? So can you break down the differences between guilt and shame for us?
Well, that's a really good question. Guilt is created by a gap that exists between your belief about yourself and your behavior. So you believe yourself to be a person of a certain behavior. You believe yourself to be a good person. You believe yourself to be a person who treats others well, who doesn't, steal candy bars from the corner store. And then you do something or you behave in a way that is contrary to what you believe about yourself. And that gap between your belief about yourself and your behavior creates the emotion of guilt. Now we'll get into, as we go along, we'll get into the differences between self-imposed guilt and guilt that others impose on you, and that's a really important difference.
But, so I just want to be clear before we go on to shame. Guilt is the gap between who you think you are and your actions.
Correct. That's exactly right.
Cool.
It's got nothing to do with your unresolved mommy issues or your unresolved daddy issues or any of those things that, Freud talked about and stuff. It's not that deep at all. In fact, it's quite simple. And because it's so simple, it's easy to get rid of.
Oh, all right. And so we can differentiate that from shame, just so people are clear which is which.
Okay, well, shame is going to be where I think that they're very much related, but I think that shame comes about from an internal belief about yourself and not living up. I think it's highly tied up with self-esteem and lack of self-esteem.
Yes, absolutely. Shame is more about who you are. Are you ashamed of who you are? Not, I mean, your actions go along with it, but shame is actually questioning you as a human. Are you worthy? Are you living up to something? Are you who you should be? Versus guilt, which is kind of action based. Are you, what you say and what you do are at odds. And so
that's exactly right. And so whereas the guilt is, I know who I am. I've got a good understanding of who I am, but now my behavior is being inconsistent with that. Shame is, I know who I am and I'm not happy about that.
Absolutely, great way of putting it. And since I came to realize that, I then found out that whoa, I'm kind of guilt prone here. I'm not really too much shame prone, but I'm guilt prone
Mm,
sometimes. Before I embarked on solving that. So let's dive right on in. You've got a course on guilt. So let's
yeah.
get into guilt. What is the? How do we even go about uh, finding out that we have guilt, even though that sounds self-explanatory, but why not ask it anyway? And how do we
Sure.
go about remedying that?
All right, then. Well, let's talk a little bit more about this, what I call the guilt gap. And that is that anytime that there's a difference or a gap between what you believe and how you act, so between what you think and what you do, it's going to show up as the emotion of guilt. So you believe yourself to be a thoughtful, kind person, for example, and then you do something to somebody else that is not thoughtful or kind, and so now you've created this tension, this dynamic tension between who you are and how you behave, and that is guilt. That emotion that you're feeling is guilt. And of course, the bigger the gap, the more intense, the stronger the feeling of guilt. And we can eliminate the guilt, that feeling of guilt, by closing the gap. Now, how do you close the gap? Well, you close the gap by either changing your behavior and bringing it into alignment with who you believe yourself to be, or you change your beliefs and say, okay, that might be who I used to think was, but no longer. And now I've seen something, I've experienced something that's causing me to change my beliefs about who I think I am. But in either case, you're bringing your beliefs and your behavior into alignment. Let me give you an example. And when I write about this stuff, I like to use examples from my own life because they're ones I've experienced. When I go back to the eighth grade, when I was, I don't know, 12, 13 years old or whatever. And at that time, I was a pretty good student. I got decent marks and all the rest of it. Believed myself to be a nice enough guy and all the rest of it. But one of the things I discovered at 13 is I realized I did not believe myself to be one of the cool kids. I was definitely not one of the cool kids at all. And so that bothered me. I thought, well, I'd really like to be one of the cool kids. And so I thought, how do I get to be one of the cool kids? Well, you can start to be one of the cool kids by hanging out with the kids who were perceived as cool. So I started doing that. And within a very short time, I suddenly found myself one day in the boys' bathroom at the school with the leader of the cool kids and a younger kid who was maybe in the sixth grade. And me and this leader of the cool kids are bullying him, and not beating him up necessarily, but definitely not being nice to this poor kid. And suddenly it hit me. I thought, man, that's not who I am. That's not how I behave. And so the guilt suddenly triggered, and that was this little warning signal for me that says, hey, just a minute, something's out of whack here. And I needed to correct that thing. I needed to correct thy behavior. Now, fortunately, I did not grow up to be an enforcer from some for some loan shark. But that little incident was a really good example of the gap between behavior and belief. Now, later on when I grew up, I spent a lot of time. I was a marketing consultant, national and international. I spent a lot of time traveling and on airplanes, hotels, and stuff away from my family. And I started to feel guilty. And the guilt was about, what do I believe myself? I believe myself to be a good father. And what does a good father do? A good father is home with his family every night. And so here I am, I'm staying in a hotel. I'm feeling guilty about that. And so one of the techniques that you can use to overcome guilt in those situations is to use a technique that we call the accept when technique. The accept when. So here's an example. I believe myself as a 13-year-old kid. I believe myself to be kind and and not a bully to kids. And so now, here I am, however, 60 years later, and I'm thinking, how do I resolve this guilt? Well, I behave that way except when I'm a 13-year-old kid who suddenly got testosterone pumping through his veins like crazy and desperate to be one of the cool kids. And that's when I behave in that manner. Well, I'm not that anymore, so I can let that guilt go. And in the case of being, a traveling, a road warrior, I'm a good father. A good father is at home every night with his kids, except when his job demands that he, be on the road to serve clients in the support of that family. I heard a story once about a fellow who was in the Marines in Vietnam, and he was suffering tremendous guilt about the killing that he had done as a Marine in the war, and spent many years in that kind of situation. And then he went to therapy, and the therapist was very useful to him. He said, yes, you believe yourself to be a person who does not kill people. Absolutely. You are a person who does not kill people, except when you were 19 years old, you'd been drafted into the Marines, you'd been shipped across to the jungles of Vietnam, somebody put a rifle in your hands, and somebody on the other side of the field is trying to kill you. And when you take that kind of approach to it, suddenly you realize, okay, I don't need to feel guilty about this. I don't want to repeat that behavior. I'm going to stay out of those situations from now on. But in terms of what has happened in the past, I can let that go.
Well, that's great. That's a great story. Now, I was thinking about the times where those things have happened to me, where maybe a friend had asked me to do something or be somewhere that I really wasn't in a position or just didn't really want to be, but then I would feel guilty for saying no. That's a very common thing, is feeling guilty for saying no. Because what is a good loyal friend do? But be there when they're called upon, to show up when they're requested, to show the other person that they really care about what the other person, a good friend doesn't say no. A good friend puts aside his time and goes out there for the other person, right?
Except when that person has, some really pressing issues of their own.
Except when they have pressing issues at home. And also, this takes even deeper thought, like, you understand that you can't be there for everyone all the time.
Exactly.
So that doesn't impact on my good, loyal friendship, but it does mean I have to make decisions about allocating my time wisely.
That's exactly right. I was talking to somebody just the other day about this, and they said that their big guilt issue is phoning in sick for work. And he said, I'm sitting here, coughing my guts out, and I'm, got a fever 103, and I phone in sick to work, saying I can't come in. But he said, then I spend the rest of the day feeling guilty. And I said, well, first of all, and we'll talk in a minute, I want to get into the difference between beneficial guilt and destructive guilt. But that's a situation where we and especially as men have been taught, come on, if you're a real man, just takes one for the team and
that's right. A real man just takes it on the chin, stay stoked, grrr.
Yeah, exactly. And how foolish is that? And yet this guilt is something that we deal with and arises in that situation where there's no need for it at all. And I talked to him and I said, well, okay, so to feel not guilty, you would go to work and bring all your germs with you, or you would go to work and do a terrible job at work. You're much, much better off. And there is genuinely some misguided thinking that's involved with this kind of guilt.
All right, actually speaking, I'm gonna do something spontaneous on the air, which I don't do. So the window is open and I'm feeling kind of guilty because trains are going by. And what does a good podcast have is lack of disturbances. So keep talking while I go out of camera to shut the window.
All right, then.
And I'm not editing this part out.
Yeah.
So you mentioned destructive guilt versus beneficial guilt. What the
Yeah.
hell is that?
All right. Let's start off with talking about beneficial guilt. Now, beneficial guilt comes around when it's imposed on you by yourself. So you have, and remember what we said, the guilt gap was this gap between your belief about yourself and your behaviors. Now, if your belief about yourself is authentically yours, so it's the belief you have formed about yourself, absent of all the influence of everybody else, and it's healthy and it's constructive. And now you do something, and my 8th grade example is a good one. You do something that is not aligned with that belief about yourself. Now that sense of guilt is going to pop up, and I like to think of it as an emotional and behavioral GPS system. So you've set a course and you've said, okay, I am this kind of a person, and a person like this behaves this way. So you've got a GPS that's saying, here's where the track is to follow. And now, just like in your car, you go off track for a little bit, that GPS will pop up and say, hey, just a minute, you've gone off track. I'm recalculating. I love it when it says recalculating. And then it'll give you a course back on to the course that you've set for yourself. Now, when you behave in a manner that's inconsistent with who you believe you are, a little red light will flash, and it's that emotion of guilt. And it'll flash on and say, hey, you're off course here a little bit. And you can then find your way back. And it nudges you. It provides, it's very beneficial. It provides the useful guidance if we recognize and act on the signals that it's sending to us. But then once you're back on track, there's no more need for the guilt. It can go away. So this beneficial guilt is always extremely temporary. As long as we act on it and we change the behavior, we correct the mistake, we adjust the belief in ourselves, then that guilt goes away. There's no need for it whatsoever. Because all of these things belong to you. The behaviors belong to you, the mistakes belong to you, the beliefs belong to you, and they're yours to change. You can change your behaviors, you can change your mistakes, you can correct them. Now, if you feel that you've made a mistake, go ahead and make good on it. And if you've treated somebody poorly, you can apologize to them if it's appropriate or whatever. And then the guilt can go away. Don't need it anymore. And that's why I call it beneficial guilt, because it's a self-correcting kind of thing.
Yes, self-correcting. It's actually a built-in system to prevent you from making mistakes, from going against your own established principles. Now, I'm going to emphasize, like you were saying, it comes from yourself. So it helps you live up to the principles that you have established.
That is exactly right. And that's a really important element of it.
That's right. It's about you, keeping you regulated. So the friendship thing I indicated earlier, it was a little bit of a check. Like, okay, I'm saying no to this person. What does that really mean? And so you break that down to make sure that, hey, is this a no just because I'm being an asshole, or is it because there's something legitimate going on?
Precisely. And what's funny is when the beliefs that we're acting on are imposed on us by other people, then it's hard for the guilt to go away. So in your situation where you said, the friend asked you to come and help and you said no, well, you can, for a moment you feel guilty of saying, oh, a good friend always says yes, except when, and you've got of your own issues to go on. Mm-hmm. But think about it. If you had said, oh, all right, I'll come and help you. Now you're feeling guilty because you're not taking care of your other obligations and the things that you're own. Yeah. So now you're out of whack as well. And this is why it's really important to be consistent and be aligned with your own personal, authentic beliefs about yourself.
This is excellent. Like, you've got to be able to be strong in your own value system and your system of principles and beliefs.
Yep.
In order for this beneficial guilt to work for you, you've got to be solid in what you believe versus what someone else wants you to believe.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into this destructive guilt that we can talk about as well, mm-hmm. because that is usually what happens when the behaviors or the beliefs that we're acting based on have been imposed on you from external sources. And when that happens, it can become chronic, it can become destructive, and it can become extremely debilitating, because you've got this built-in internal conflict that's unresolvable, because I have to behave this way in order to make my boss happy. I have to behave this way in order to make my friend happy. I have to behave this way in order to make my mother happy. My mother says I should phone her every day. Well, I don't want to phone her every day, so now I feel guilty about it. My
And go
personal
even
belief.
further. I have to live this way because my tradition tells me, my culture tells me, my religion tells me, my
Oh,
kid tells me, the
yeah.
government tells. We can just go on and on and on.
Oh man, there are no end of authority figures who want to control you and tell you this is how you behave. Now, really, one of the really interesting things that I find is that these things, and this takes us a little bit into the anxiety field as well, because there's so many of us who live to please others. One of our primary things is I want to make other people happy. When you said no to your friend, I'm sure you're like me, you're one of these people, so many people, we don't like to say no. We don't want to turn people down. And so we make decisions based on what we think will make other people happy. But then I realized and found myself in, we all find ourselves in situations where two different people, both of whom are important to you, are asking you opposite things. I want you to do this because that'll make me happy. Somebody else wants you to do something different because that'll make them happy. Where does that leave you? And as
They're
long
kind
as
of
you're
caught in the
making
middle like a sandwich, and not a fun sandwich either.
not in the least a fun sandwich. And so that's why it's so important that this belief about who you are be your own and be authentically yours.
Absolutely. So just, I talk about this on the program a lot, just feeling guilty about uh, not doing what someone else wants you to do. That's something that needs to be, if you can change that, you can change that. You do not have to live for anyone else, even if it's your mammy.
Yeah.
And just, you got to be strong, because some of this stuff, your mother's going to be disappointed. You're going to make your mother cry. Or, of course, more globally, if you do this or you live this way, you're going to hell.
That's right.
So
That's
you're
right.
going to hell. So
Yeah.
we really, that's why it's so important to really do the work on ourselves, to really be clear on what we believe, who we are, what makes sense to us versus what makes sense in a book or to
Mm-hmm.
somebody else.
Yeah. It's that internal work that we're doing that, and you have to get, I had somebody the other day say, well, how do I then know? How do I find out what my real authentic thoughts about myself are?
Ah.
And that's where we have to do that internal work. We have to get quiet. We have to get alone. Meditation is a perfect way to get in touch with who you believe you really are. Now, who you believe you really are evolves and it changes as we grow, and that's perfectly all right. But we got to start off with a sort of a base, and then work from there. So who do we feel we are? And when you get quiet, and when you get alone and stop all the noise, you start to really, you're able to recognize, that's how I feel about such and such. This is who I think I am. And you can tell simply by the feeling of contentment, the feeling of peace that comes over you when you are aligned with who you really are. And when you are surrounded by nothing but noise from other people, and this person saying do this and do that, and the church saying you should do this, and your mother saying do that, or your father, you should don't go and be a musician, be a doctor like me that you can make a good living, or be a lawyer like me. And my father was and his father was, why aren't you?
Or in culture, of course, a real man does this. A real
Oh
man
yeah.
doesn't do that. If you're a real man, you wouldn't be like this. Real
Uh-huh.
men do that.
Yeah.
Real men get all the girls they want. If you're not after a girl, you're not a real man.
Yeah.
A real man doesn't cry. If you're crying, you're a pussy.
Isn't that, I mean, it's so ridiculous. And now we're stuck being torn in so many different directions because we get all this input from so many different people and so many different sources and culture and religion and parents and teachers and on and on and on. And it's no wonder we have this anxiety because we're just being torn apart inside. You cannot be all those things to all those people and survive.
No, no. So how do we dive in? How do we cut through all of this noise and culture and other imposed issues upon us through this guilt course you have?
Well, that's a great question. The way you do it is by, as I say, first of all, you got to recognize, hey, all right, I got to find the real me. I have to discover what I feel. What do I believe about myself? And so I got to quiet down. And I'm a big, as I mentioned a second ago, I'm a big proponent of meditation. I'm a big proponent of spending time in nature if it's possible. Big proponent of just go to a quiet museum. I know you live in the big city, and it's not always easy to get out into nature, but if you can just get to a quiet place, museums, art galleries are nice and quiet. Just go sit in a park for a while and close your eyes and just try to tune out all the noise. Now, it takes practice. I've been meditating regularly now for probably close to 10 years, and I do 30 minutes every single day. And even still, the noise that goes on in my head is comical sometimes when all the thoughts are trying to crowd in there. But as with any other skill, you can train yourself to do it, and you can start to get very quiet and tune out the noise. It's it's kind of like trying to see the stars at noon when the sun's blazing. It's only when the sun disappears that the stars come out because they're too faint. And that inner voice that tells you and is very reliably coaching you on who the real you are. But that inner voice speaks very quietly, and we have to get quiet enough to be able to hear it telling us, and that'll give you the guidance as to who you are and what it is you should be listening to, as opposed to all the other people that are shouting at you. So I'm a big proponent of regularly getting quiet in nature, in a park, in a gallery, in meditation, just sitting quietly on the couch by yourself for a few minutes. Just 10 minutes in a day would be wonderful.
Mm-hmm. What's another step? So let's say I'm meditating. Well, I meditate too, but just to move the conversation along. So we're meditating and we're kind of moving through that. The person has gone to coreconfidencelife.com and taken the free meditation course that's on there, and they've mastered their version of meditation that does them the best. So what's the next step?
The next step is to then, for the guilt, is to recognize where this gap lies. So I've said, okay, now I understand who I really am. And now I see the behavior that's causing the gap. And having gotten quiet, I can recognize, is the belief that I'm holding here, is that one of my own, or is that one that somebody else is imposing on me? And by getting quiet, I can recognize, oh no, that's my mother's voice talking. No, that's my, fifth grade teacher's voice talking. That's my old baseball coach's voice talking. I can hear it, I can see his face when he's telling me this stuff.
Also, I want to throw in there, the voice may not even be attached to a person. It could be an imaginary voice of society or culture.
Yes.
It's that amorphous voice that says, no, that's not manly. No, you should. So it's not a specific person. Maybe it's not your daddy or your friend, but it's that amorphous collective voice of culture and religion saying, don't do that. People who will do that are bad.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. But that's how you can start to realize and saying, and then I'll catch myself and I think, okay, why am I wanting to do this? Oh, I'm wanting to do this to look good in other people's eyes. I'm wanting to do this to impress so-and-so. That's not authentic me. And now I catch myself and saying, okay, here's why I'm feeling uncomfortable, because I'm behaving this way. What's causing me to behave this way? It's the pressure from, as you say, some amorphous voice of society or culture saying this is how I ought to behave. And now I can recognize, because I've gotten quiet, I recognize, and now I can decide what I want to do about that. I can decide, do I want to stop this behavior? Or I can decide, do I want to adjust my own personal belief?
Do you want
Because
to
either
adopt
way,
this into your own? Exactly. Oh, okay, listen, mommy says this. Do I actually agree with that? You know, she's saying this, it's making me, but do I actually really agree with it?
right.
I always say, ask the question, because I always say that I'm not a compliant person, but I'm also not a rebel, because
Right.
I think those are two sides of the same coin. I try to be more independent about things. Like, okay, here's a belief or here's a trend that's going on in the culture or whatever. Do I
Yeah.
think it's okay myself or
Yeah.
not? If I think it's okay, I don't have a problem adapting to it and being so-called like everyone else, because I've analyzed it and I say, oh, this is good for me.
Yeah.
But when I find a gap, well, this is what everyone is doing, but I find this a bit problematic. So I think I'll stay out of it.
That's an interesting example, because I've found, as you're talking, I just realized, I have my own business and I try to promote it and stuff. And I say, oh, okay, what I need to do, I need to tweet every day. I need to tweet 6 times every day. Everybody else is doing that. That's what I should do. And so I work at that, and I don't enjoy it. I don't, I have to, it's an effort for me. And so that's when I get quiet and think, okay, is this my own personal belief saying that this is what I should do? No, it just doesn't feel right. I do it occasionally and enjoy it, but the kind of frequency that I'm told and pressured to do, that, no, sorry, I just don't get it. So I don't.
Yeah, so yeah, analyze whether you agree with it or not, because everyone's like, oh, you're such a follower or you're such a rebel, whatever it is. But for me, I'm neither. I analyze what it is. And also I have things that I consider neutral. All right, what are they doing? All right, well, this is neutral to me. I don't have an opinion on it either way, but does it do me any good to do it?
Right.
Like, for example, for me, tweeting is kind of a neutral issue.
Uh-huh.
So does it do good for my business or not? I'm neutral about it. I don't have a strong opinion about it either way. So would it be useful for me to use it for my business? But if
Mhm.
you already have an opinion or a philosophy around tweeting, then you go with that. But if it's neutral for you, then you can play with it as a utility.
Yeah, oh, I absolutely agree with that. But then as time goes on, you might change a little bit, and you
Hmm.
might, having done it, might start to believe, oh, I'm really enjoying this more
Yeah.
than I thought I was. And so I'm
Hmm.
now moving more towards the positive, away from the neutral, or the other direction as well.
Like, oh, I've been doing this, and I started out, it was all right, but yeah, I think I'll stop now.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So total
And this
independent
this
mind.
is Yeah, this is really gets to the point. We talked about the difference between the beneficial guilt, which is that internal GPS system, and then the destructive guilt, which is imposed on you by other people. Now, when you recognize that I'm acting on behaviors that other people have imposed on me or pressured me to do, sidestepping that guilt is more difficult, because now we've got another issue involved, and that is, my if my self-confidence is built on the opinions of others, and now I'm, as not necessarily a rebel, but independent thinker, and but I still want to please other people. Now that adds a layer of complexity, and that's where it overlaps with our unsubscribe from anxiety, because we look at all those issues of trying to please other people as a source of anxiety. And so I've got to look at my level of self-esteem and my level of self-confidence and build those back up, so I then have the strength to, as you did, say no to your friend, and knowing that it's not going to ruin the friendship and it's not going to make him hate you.
That's an excellent point. That because once we figured out that this philosophy we're trying to live under is a foreign invader, once we figure that out,
Yeah,
then it's moving to the deprogramming stage. And I think
yeah,
that being able to get your self-esteem and self-confidence up is very important, as part of the deprogramming stage. Because if you've outsourced your confidence to someone else's thought process, you have to first claw that back.
yeah, yeah. And for those of us who are, build our self-esteem on the opinions of others, that's a really, really difficult thing to do. And so one of the things we like to tell people is to, on a daily basis, a regular basis, review your successes. Sort of go back and say, all right, and in Unsubscribe from Anxiety, we talk about a little exercise that says, okay, go back 5 things before you turned 18 that you were really, really proud of. And then 5 things when you were starting college or in your first job that you were really, really proud of. And five things in your 30s. And then 5 things last week. And then what you do is start to build your own self-esteem based on your own opinion of yourself, rather than it being dependent on what others think of you. That then allows you, as you said, to deprogram and sort of disconnect from those opinions that other people have of you, and think for yourself. It's really interesting in these days right now. There's so little thinking for ourselves going on. Everybody's saying, what should I think? What should I think? And relying on other people to tell them what to think.
And yes, and gathering information is different than listening to other people.
Yes.
Like, you can gather evidence to make better informed decisions, but be careful of the difference between evidence and someone's opinion masked as evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's for sure. There's too much of that floating around.
Yeah. All right. So we got our self-esteem going. You know, we're quiet. We found out which one was ours, which one was the other. Then we got to deprogram. So we got our self-esteem going. Now what next?
Well, let's go full circle back to the beginning where we talked about this gap. So now I recognized, all right, this is my genuine behavior or my genuine belief about myself. This is or was my behavior. So I behaved this way, or I'm continuing to behave this way. Now I recognize that the gap between those two is the source of my guilt. And it's not just the source of my guilt, but it is showing up as that emotion of guilt. That's how it manifests. And now I get to decide, what do I want to do about this? And as we said earlier, if the gap is really large, then the emotion of guilt is quite intense and really strong. If it's very small, then it's only a minor kind of thing. I mean, you know, for example, I'm a person, I believe myself to be a person who is healthy, who eats well, who exercises on a regular basis. And then one night I'm watching a movie at 11 o'clock and I just have this craving for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and I indulge in it at 11 o'clock at night. Now, I know that that's not right. So my belief about myself and my behavior have created a gap, but it's not a massive gap. It's just a small little gap. And I'll think, okay, well, tonight I did that, but tomorrow I'll get back to my regular behavior, and I can make that adjustment more easily. But if it's a big gap, and I believe myself to be a kind person, but any money I make, I'm not sharing with others. I'm not giving to charity. I'm not, in some people's belief that tithing is an important thing, and I'm not doing any of those things, and I'm inconsistent about doing that. So that might be a bigger gap that I want to really examine and say, all right, what do I genuinely believe in this? And if I believe that I ought to be sharing more of my prosperity with other people, well, how can I start to then adjust my behavior? Maybe I'm carrying around a belief from my childhood that, the old money doesn't grow on trees. I got to hang on to every penny that I make, etc. Well, maybe I could start small and gradually adjust my behavior to become more in line with my thinking about myself. And then it gets easier, and then I can, start, people who tithe say 10%. Maybe it can start with 1% and sort of get used to it and then ramp it up from there. Something like that is how we start making the adjustments to our behaviors if we've discovered that there's this gap between the belief and the behavior. But I really do want to make sure that people understand that guilt is not a really complex thing that I have to go to therapy for and spend years and years dealing with unresolved mommy issues. It's really quite simple. It's simply this gap. And once you identify the gap, You get to decide what you want to do with it.
Wow, that's great. And in there is a very important mind shifts and work that we talk about often here on the program. So let's get the specifics about the actual course, which is what you're here to talk about. And we just went through the process. Is there another process after you've been able to close the gap? I guess you're cured then, huh?
Well, you are, except that, and it's the same. The same as the anxiety. Guilt is a habit too.
Yeah.
And so, our mind likes to fall back into our habitual ways of thinking.
Yeah.
So you got to catch yourself on a regular basis. And in order to live a guilt-free life, there's a few steps involved. First of all, you got to resolve to use guilt constructively. So the beneficial stuff, I'm going to recognize it and say, ooh, that's my little GPS trying to bring me back on course. So instead of seeing it as an emotional drain that I want to avoid at all costs, I'm going to recognize it as a beneficial ally and say, oh, I want to use that to my advantage. So that's a mind shift that we can do. So, and then I want to see it as a tool that will help me, guide me, and help me grow and live the life that I want to live. Because here, this little inner voice is so useful to nudge you when you get off track a little bit. So let's see it as that internal guidance system that was going to help us get to the destination that we've chosen rather than somebody else has chosen for us. So I want to list 8 steps. Step number one, recognize that I am feeling an emotion of guilt. That's the step number one. Oh, okay, I'm feeling something. It doesn't feel great. It's guilt, as opposed to anger or frustration or something like that. Step number 2, listen accurately to the voice that's in your head. Don't muffle it. Don't judge the voice that's going on in your head. Get quiet and listen to what it has to say to you. Number 3, analyze and pinpoint the source of this voice. Is it someone else's voice? Is it culture's voice? Is it, Miss Smith from 3rd grade? Is it your mother? Or is it genuinely you? Pinpoint the source. Step 4, decide if that voice is valid or not. If it's genuinely yours, it's valid. If it's somebody else's, may not be. Step 5, if it's not valid, you can safely ignore it. You can just leave it, walk away from the guilt. I have no requirement to feel guilty about anything here. But if you decide that that voice and that message you're getting is in fact valid, decide if you want to change your beliefs or change your behavior. I got to change one of them to close this gap. Which one do I want to change? Step 7, do the act of changing. Make the changes either in your belief or your behaviors. And step 8, let it go, because you're done. You've done everything that you needed to do about the guilt. There is no need to carry it around any further.
Did you skip 6? I was following along here. I don't know.
6 was if the voice is accurate. If you do decide that the voice is accurate, decide if you want to change your beliefs or your behavior.
There you go. Maybe it just went over my head. You did say that. It just flew over my head like a falcon. Falcon. And I think those are 8 very important points. And I've gone through that process. And you got to go through the process sometimes in the beginning, very consciously. Because it's a very conscious decision. It's a very deliberate actions. And then once you really get the hang of this thing, it'll become subconscious. It'll become, okay, well, that's someone else's voice, so I can, go back to reading.
Yeah.
So, yeah, cool. So how long is this course?
It's only 45 minutes.
It's only 45 minutes.
Yeah, it's a short little one. It's really inexpensive, and it's on our website, on the i-fearless.com website. And you can go to the online courses, and it's called Guilt Free Today. And tell you what, Dennis, I'm going to set up a special code so listeners from on your podcast can get the course for free. And I will send that to you, and you can put it up on your website, and people can take that course for free if they want.
There you go, a free course. of ending the, what is the name of the program exactly?
It's called Guilt Free Today.
Guilt Free Today. And
Yep.
so by the time this show is airing, there'll be information probably about the way to get it for free.
Yeah,
So
we'll give you the secret code, and then they can enter the secret code and they can get it for free.
absolutely. Well, thank you for a great conversation with great work. This work is so heavily needed because guilt needs to be understood and, if at all possible, ended. And I think that your course takes a flying leap towards that goal. And I know the process because I've had to walk through that process myself about whose voice is who and who am I really and
Yeah.
what does definitions of words mean. What does friend
Hmm.
mean? What does being a good son mean? All those things need to be redefined if you're having guilt problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you for landing on the program again, guilt-free and anxiety-free.
Yeah, I think the world could do really well with a whole lot less of both.
Absolutely. So go out and click on the links you may find when watching this, and you will be able to get the course. And don't forget to go to coreconfidencelife.com, and right there on the main page under featured courses, you could actually take a free meditation course. So all that and a bag of chips.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming on the program, sir.
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate you inviting me again.
Absolutely. Now, of course, I'm gonna turn the recording off